Is exploring some of the same themes, but more specifically on the MENA region. We'll dive in a little more detail, and we'll start in a second with a presentation that sort of sets the theme for that. But before we do that, allow me to introduce the panelists that have just joined me on stage. To my right is Ms. Yara Anabtawi. She's the Executive Director of Operational Planning and Strategy with Aqua Power. I don't think Aqua requires an introduction in this region. Next, Dr. Rabia Faruqi. Dr. Rabia is with IRENA. She's the head of knowledge, policy, and finance, so she leads all the policy work there, and she will kindly start us off with a great presentation that focuses not just on MENA, but actually on the GCC, which is a report that will be published tomorrow by IRENA. So that's something very interesting we get a bit of a preview on. To her right, I have Adam Warren. Adam is joining us from the US Department of Energy's National Renewable Energy Lab, or NREL. To most of us, welcome and thank you very much for joining us. That's giving us a perspective of having an international NREL sort of perspective on some of the MENA trends that we're experiencing, so we look forward to that. Thank you. To Adam's right, I've got Mr. Holger Gassner. Holger is Head of Strategy and Regulatory Affairs at RW Energy, and so he brings a utility/renewables and utility perspective, both global and also for MENA. Thank you very much for joining us. Next, I have Raed Bikairat. Raed is VP of Business Development for the Middle East region with First Solar. Again, I don't think First Solar requires any introduction to most people here in the MENA region. So thank you very much for joining us, Raed. And last, but by no means least, Bruce Smith. Bruce Smith is advisor and acting planning director with Abu Dhabi Water and Electricity Company. And so we are very much looking forward to hear also from Bruce about how renewables and all the other energy sources that are in the pipeline for Abu Dhabi, how that's going to fit into the discussion. Thank you very much for joining us, and if I may ask Rabia, please to start us off with your presentation.
Thank you very much, Hannes. So it's working, right? Okay. Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. It's an honor for me to be here. We've been here for the third time. So it's becoming a tradition, and it's thanks to all the organizations involved doing that, but also to the great energy and enthusiasm of our friend Roberto Vigotti in pulling us all together in working on this. So what we'll do today is look at the GCC. Obviously, yes, it is an epicenter of hydrocarbon, but not the rest of the MENA. Unfortunately, I'm looking just at the GCC today, but we can also bring some insights later on the rest of the countries, which are mostly energy importing countries. The report that we're launching tomorrow is a series of reports that we started at IRENA this year with the GCC. In a couple of months, we will have Latin America, that tries to provides some insight into best practices, innovative policy making, project development and financing that are slowly paving the way or facilitating the deployment of renewable energy. We are specifically looking at certain emerging issues that are sort of at the intersection of public policy and market developments to see what kind of impact that has on the deployment of renewables. It is very dear to our work at IRENA to also look at the broader socioeconomic conditions and the energy sector and how they relate to the energy sector dynamics that ultimately will influence decision making. And we look also at the opportunities, barriers, and we provide some recommendations for each region that we are analyzing. So, okay, I hope I can make this work. Yeah. So the GCC, most of the pictures and the graphs that you will see are in the report that is launched tomorrow. As you all know, GCC economies have experienced a tremendous socioeconomic development in recent decades, and this growth has basically been driven by oil and gas revenues and the growth-oriented policies that to expand mostly industry that have led to some of the world's highest living standards. Hydrocarbon exports constituted almost 80% of total government revenue in 2013. And if you see here, in that year, the GCC accounted for more than 32% of the world's total liquid exports, around a quarter of global crude oil production, and 30% of proven crude oil reserves. In terms of gas, the region holds also 22% of the gas reserves, though it only represents about 10% of global gas production, and that's mostly in Qatar. Important to note is the fact that some GCC countries, though, just like Oman and UAE, are turning into imports. So the perspective that we're taking in this analysis is to go from the global energy sector rather than start from renewables and see how the trends have developed. We see there a clear trend towards imports in a couple of countries, and this is partly due to established long-term contracts, but also to the very rapidly increasing demand of energy domestically. So the GCC, the high growth in demand has resulted from the rapidly increasing population, economic growth, rapid industrialization, infrastructure development, and it's, as you know, occurring in a harsh climate where cooling and desalination needs are very high. So key sectors that are contributing to the trends that you see on the slide are electricity and water. In the last decade, the growth of electricity demand in end-use sectors, residential, commercial, and industrial, has been much higher than the global average. So the power sector, for example, is exclusively fueled by oil and gas, and which comes obviously at certain costs, be they environmental, but also in terms of the opportunity cost that this oil and gas could bring to the economies. So some of the rationale that for energy diversification that we have seen are in this next slide, with one I've just spoken about, which is the opportunity cost of the foregone earnings from fossil fuel exports, obviously maybe not as relevant currently. But in addition, you have pressures on government budgets due to the energy pricing structure in these countries. You have a growing concern about some of the climate change and the environmental impacts, and you have implication on other resources, and the threat to water and food security is becoming an issue that we hear about more and more. So all these elements have slowly inspired countries to devise strategies and for improving energy efficiency and trying to integrate alternative sources of energy. And of course, the abundance of solar resources has been instrumental also in establishing the case for renewable energy in the energy diversification strategies. If you see in the next graph, an analysis was conducted by IRENA for the first time, and this is thanks to the Global Atlas team, that shows that 60% of GCC surface area has excellent suitability for solar PV deployment. And developing just 1% of this area could create almost 470 gigawatts of additional power generation. The wind resources may not be as good there on your right as the solar, but we find that there is significant potential in a few countries, Kuwait, Oman, and Saudi Arabia. So we usually show that we have until very recently, we used to show this particular map with renewable energy targets in the region. So increasingly, we will not only focus on the, thanks to the solar energy potentials that you just have seen, on the plans for diversification through the integration of larger shares of renewable energy, in particular solar, but also that through the energy efficiency measures that some of the countries are introducing. I would like to underline the fact that most of these targets and projects or plans were introduced over 2 years ago. And then we had a sort of period of quiet period that unfolded for about 2 years until in the 200 megawatt project, the second phase of the DEWA, solar power project in Dubai, where everybody, of course, knows the landmark low price of electricity that was reached through the auction, and then the dynamic that it sort of gave in the region through a few projects both in Dubai and Abu Dhabi, but also now we see some seeds of enthusiasm in a couple of other countries, such as in Kuwait. So you have here most of the project and the state of development in the region that that we're happy to share. So, instrumental to these developments are obviously the regulatory and the policy frameworks to incentivize the deployment. There are many different, of course, policies. I cannot go into them, but what seems to have worked, of course, in this case for large-scale deployments is the auction mechanism that brought the prices down. Paolo showed some of the prices that we've seen in the aftermath of the prices that took place, that resulted in the very low price last year in Dubai, but many others have come. This rising competitiveness, we have looked at different studies that have calculated the cost competitiveness in comparison to conventional sources. So interestingly enough, the 5.85 cent per kilowatt price shows that solar is competitive with the cost of electricity generation in the region from an oil that is priced at $20 per barrel and gas that is priced at $5 per million BTU. And it is also competitive with alternatives such as coal and nuclear, obviously. The design of the Dubai auctions, and many people on the panel will talk to this in much more detail, succeeded basically in bringing the price down, mainly due to the creditworthiness of the off-taker, DIWA, and the long-term vision for solar deployment in the region, and a few other elements that I will tell Aqua Power and First Solar talk to. Maybe just very briefly, what is interesting in the investment figures that you see on the slide is the fact that this increased cost competitiveness is leading to more deployment for less investment in terms of the value. So if you look at the difference, that's the 3 years in between are the years where I told you there was a sort of quiet period. But if you compare 2011 to 2015, you see that with this about the same amount of investment of 800 million, you have almost basically one project in 2011, which is Shams, so the 100 megawatt CSP, and then you have in 2015 the Dubai 200 megawatt PV and the Shagai 70 megawatts, 10 megawatts wind, 10 megawatts PV, and 50 CSP that is taking place in Kuwait. So maybe just before I conclude, one more interesting slide that we would like to show. There is much more detailed analysis in the report on this, which is the fact that the development in the market has attracted players in different segments of the value chain. It's a very different segments of value chains that we saw before in terms of more developed and more mature markets. But here we see that from projects to system planning, manufacturing, construction, O&M, and certain financial services, you have different players positioning themselves, and a lot of them that are local players. Maybe the reason I'm showing that is that some of the work that we do, I mean, we keep on hearing about the availability of finance, capital, policies, etc. But I think sometimes we tend to forget about the broader objective, which is also a development objective. In this case, you know, localizing industries could benefit the region. In fact, we have looked at the benefits that could accrue from meeting the targets that the region each country in the region has announced by 2030, and scaling up renewable energy would reap multiple benefits across the countries. And we have assessed that the economic benefits from reaching the 80 gigawatt renewable energy capacity that is announced. So the GCC has the potential to create jobs. In 2030, we could come to 207,000 jobs in that year. The cumulative saving of 2.5 billion barrels of oil equivalent in the period between 2015 and 2030 could lead anywhere from 55 to 87 billion, depending on the oil and gas prices. And we have looked also at how much the region would reduce in terms of carbon emission. That's 1 gigaton of CO2 until 2030. That's potentially resulting in an 8% reduction in per capita carbon footprint in the GCC. As you know, per capita footprint in the GCC is one of the highest in the world. An annual reduction of 11 trillion liters of water withdrawals in 2030, and a 16% reduction, that's a 16% reduction in water withdrawal. As you know, the region is one of the highest water scarce region in the world, so these elements matter. Now, the GCC have been endowed and are endowed with hydrocarbon resources that have fueled development until now. I think given that it's blessed with abundant solar resources and given the cost competitiveness and the additional benefits that the region can reap from going towards renewables and solar in particular, we think that future economic growth can be fueled by renewable energy, solar in particular, provide employment for future generation, and move towards a more sustainable development path. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Rabia, for that presentation. Great to see an overview of all the topics that I think matter both to the region and the energy mix and to this discussion. I think there'll be quite a lot within that we can pick up on. You mentioned cost, you mentioned different technologies. I think we'll try to cover all of those, and if we can, we'll even pick up the question that Christina kindly left for us, but we'll see if we have time for that. So could I now ask, perhaps if we start just with a brief opening statement by each panelist, roughly a minute or so, give us a perspective sort of addressing maybe not so much the longer term, which the report that we also saw just now explores, but 2016. What's your perspective for this year? What drives some of the trends that we're seeing, that energy mix discussion? If you could try to address that in your opening statement. Bruce, please, if I could ask you to start.
Okay, ADWEC is responsible for planning the future capacity requirements in Abu Dhabi. We've got two objectives. One is to ensure security of supply, and one is to do so at least cost. At the prices that we see today, with gas at $6.50 and above, slightly more than Rabia was saying, we see that PV saves money. Now, the implications of that, you've probably seen, Abu Dhabi's announced its invitations for expressions of interest in a 350 megawatt plant, and we're probably looking at up to 8 gigawatts by 2030 on a least cost economic basis. Planning is an inexact science. That figure will be driven by future costs, and it'll be driven by the demand forecasts in the future. PV will not replace gas. We will require some flexibility to dispatch, which PV at the moment on its own doesn't provide. I think I've used my minute up, so I'll stop there. I'm sure there'll be further questions that come on after this.
Great, thank you very much. Dr. Raad,
Sure.
please.
I mean, this is exactly the point. I think what we see now in 2016, really a continuation of what happened or started in 2015. We see solar becoming more and more competitive, and we will continue to see very aggressive pricing into the marketplace that will do exactly what Bruce had discussed. We think PV can be competitive with sub $6.50 in BTU, maybe in the range of $5, oil at $30. It's quite an interesting time actually for solar. I think this is just the tip of the iceberg, by the way. If you go back to 2009, you would have a hard time adding up 50 megawatts of solar across the Middle East. Today, if you consider what's going to be tendered in 2016 and what's in progress from getting ready to sign PPAs to execution, you're looking at 5 gigawatts of solar, primarily, obviously, PV. And again, this is just the tip of the iceberg in my mind. So it's quite exciting times, and actually we will see more and more of the happy marriage between solar and gas-based generation. I'll just leave it at that.
Great, thank you very much. We'll get back to some of that, I believe, in one of the next questions. Holger, please, if I could ask you.
Yeah, thank you very much. Pleasure to be here. Thank you for the invite. I can build on that what is said previously. I think especially in 2016 we will see some great outcomes on the cost perspective for the tenders which are out. But on the same time, I would like to say, representing a utility coming from Germany and having some experience along the entire value chain, what this change means, and also keep a system running, not in a growing, but in a stable, or when you take energy efficiency as a goal, maybe also in a declining consumption climate, is a little bit different than the challenges we have here. But there's one request also. I think it's very important with a look to the next tenders coming up. The fight on getting LOCE down and down and down is not the only goal. So as Paolo already said, we need to have in place something looking at the entire system. And I think we have to add some challenges for how could the PV respond to the system, and taking some parts of system quality within the tenders as crucial to keep it continually growing. At the moment, it's just in a way adding capacities, and it's not that crucial at that time, but that should be early get into the thinking for the future.
Okay, thank you. Great perspective. Please, Adam.
Sure. You asked me to kind of provide a U.S. perspective, and it's interesting. Unlike oil, natural gas, we don't have a global marketplace. So what we're experiencing in our world in the U.S. is not what you're experiencing in the rest of the world. You know, the natural gas and the shale revolution has dropped the price of natural gas in the U.S. such that it competes quite effectively against the price of, for example, solar and wind. But it also, we're learning it as we look at going forward, if we're really going to reach the high penetrations of wind and solar that we need to meet our global challenges on climate change, we're going to need that natural gas. We're going to need the flexibility of that natural gas in order to keep the grid working. That flexibility is required when you have a non-dispatchable source of power like wind and solar. So hopefully the things that we're learning in the U.S. can be reapplied and used elsewhere as we continue to look at higher penetrations of wind, higher penetrations of solar worldwide.
Great, thank you. We'll also pick up on that gas renewables side quite a bit from both pricing, but also are they competing or are they having a happy marriage sort of perspective. Thank you. Yara, if I may ask you, please.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'll take a more philosophical approach and not necessarily 2016 outlook. I look at ourselves and I see a very energy-dependent world. I've tried to make myself have a detox from all electronic gadgets, let's say only for half a day, and I have consistently failed. This tells me, from a business perspective, that energy mix and diversification is extremely important, irrespective whether it had the huge climate impact that we now know is real, or economic issues. Just the fact that we should not be dependent on one fuel source is extremely important. And the good side of this is that every place in this world has options for different fuels, energy sources. So I don't think it's a happy marriage or a bad marriage or one or the other. There is a place for each one of these fuel sources. It's very situational. It's very dependent on the need, the access to the resource. So it's not a debate of one or the other, but more of very, situational case-by-case basis. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much for that. Let me pick up on that a little bit and go back to some of the comments that were made earlier. So for natural gas, which as we've seen and as we all know, the region is very well endowed with, and also with renewable resources, mostly solar. I've picked up a few parts from the introductions and also from the presentation that sort of allude a little bit on how those two go together. So what I'd like to explore is, are they competing? Are they having a happy marriage? Is it, the discussions around costs that says at what price will solar PV beat gas, or it's beating gas at a certain price? So I'd like to hear first about price, and then also about just the operational, what is the technological side of that? Some of you mentioned the flexibility that we'll need in the system to make that happen. So perhaps first on cost. We've seen estimates of $5. Bruce in his master plan, I think, has a figure of 6.5. Globally, there are estimates that, of course, vary also by how much sunshine you get out of your solar panels. Who'd like to comment perhaps on what is that level, or have we passed that level where solar PV is competing on a cost basis with natural gas? Any takers? Please, Bruce, if you'd like to start.
In an environment where gas today is being sold in the US at $2 or $3 in Henry Hub, the question is, are we going to see a convergence of global gas prices at $2 or $3? Now, if we do, what does that mean for the gas price that we'll pay here? Now, by the time you've liquefied that gas, shipped it here, regasified it, delivered it to the power station, you're still paying about $6.50. So even if we see a convergence of global gas prices at Henry Hub, then PV at today's prices is still competitive. Now, from a planning perspective, that doesn't mean that we don't do any more gas-fired power stations, because we still need the flexibility of being able to dispatch power when we need it. And of course, the sun's not shining all the time. And until we've got storage as an alternative to gas, we'll still have gas.
Thank you, Rod, please.
Maybe just to add to that, I think there is an element as well. To be fair, it's hard to compare combined cycle generation assets with solar. Again, this is the topic of dispatchability, but how can solar allow planners, for example, to push back on their investments in capacities that are only driven by peak loads? See, the issue in the GCC, for example, is that peak load is growing at a higher rate than the average load. And yet, utilities have to build combined cycle power plants, have to build coal plants, nuclear plants, only to deal with a peak. And this is where we come in as the solar industry and say, solar can allow to shave that peak and improve the utilization factor on existing assets and defer investments. And I think that calculation sometimes is missed in terms of the comparison between gas as a basic generation assets and solar. Again, it depends on the energy mix that you look at. I think in the GCC, we're looking at nuclear as a constant baseload generation, overlapping with gas, overlapping with renewables, primarily solar. And I think that's the happy mix that we talk about.
Okay, thank you very much. Holger, please, if you'd like to comment.
Maybe I could point a thesis. I want to decouple it a little bit. So just the discussion price. Not that price and economics is not very important, otherwise my controlling department will kill me. But the point is, I mean, here in the region, it's nearly, we talk about solar is competitive to gas. In Europe, UK, for example, wind onshore is competitive to gas. Why? There's more wind and here's more solar. So it's relatively what you look at, and so it's also relatively what you compare it. And if, as long as you have growth and you could add the capacities to the system, you could talk about this, what is more competitive. But if you look at Europe with huge overcapacities, you have coal as an overcapacity, you have gas as an overcapacity, and so the entire benchmark, the wholesale price, nothing is at the moment comparable. So you really have to look how the system setup is and what you want to have in the system. And I'm personally convinced if storage, for example, gets cheaper, the question is not what is more competitive, PV or gas in this region, it's gas or storage. That's the question then how, because you have to do the setup. And so it's moving over time, and it's important for the next investment decision because it goes over the costs. But building up a system takes a longer view, and adaptation as well.
Great. That brings me to that other point, which is it's not just about the cost, and it's maybe about comparing gas with battery storage or other ways of storage. That is that flexibility point or that complementarity point, the operational or the technical side. Perhaps Bruce and then Paolo, if you'll allow me, I'll take the liberty to put you on the spot as well on this question. Bruce, can you elaborate a little bit how in that master planning that you mentioned earlier, how does that play in that we're talking about price for both technologies, but actually they're not perfectly comparable? How does that flexibility play out in your master planning?
What we're trying to do is to minimize the total system cost. So you can't just look at the LCOE for PV and compare that with the LCOE for gas. We have to ensure that we've got the capacity there when we need it. And even if that means that that peaking plant or that CCGT is only operating for a few percent of the hours of the year, you still have to build that capacity in order to be there. So the objective from an expansion planning perspective is to minimize the total system cost. So if that can be achieved by PV plus battery storage, more cheaply than PV plus gas, or more cheaply than gas on its own, once you've satisfied your security objective, the objective is least cost, provided there's no other policy direction, of course.
Okay, thank you very much. Paolo, I know that the IEA has done quite a lot of work on this. Do you mind making a quick comment on this point?
I think the single aspect that I would like to emphasize is not just look at supply, but also at demand. The first is an intelligent use of energy, and I have to say, every time I'm in the region and in the US, I'm freezing inside, then I get a collapse outside. This is where I see potential for improvement, to say the least. The second is at larger demand-side management. There are many, many technologies available to do peak shift, and which can do a lot in order to maximize the use combined of PV and to optimize the utilization rate of gas. This kind of optimization should be the overall goal. And my message is don't look just at supply, but also demand.
Great, thank you very much. So I know that some of that is happening indeed in the region. Are we seeing enough of that? Are we looking at obviously not just the price and the occurrence of it, but also how demand could be managed?
You know, I think we're still in the early stages of that. When we talk about demand management, a lot of people think about demand within a building like this or in residential. There are other big power users that, particularly in this region, that I think there hasn't been enough research in. I was in a panel or a discussion this morning. They were talking about the high use of desalination technologies here in this region in particular. And as climate change continues to happen, we're going to expand the use of desalination across the world. We need to be looking at those technologies and understand how high loads like that can be designed so that they can provide that demand response that we're going to need.
Great, thank you. Bruce, in the master plan, I'm going to come back to you once more. How do you deal with demand forecasting? How does that demand side feature into the supply side planning for gas, renewables, and others?
At the moment, the master plan assumed business as usual. We've then run a scenario which said, okay, if we were to effectively implement demand-side management and were to achieve a 15% reduction in total demand by 2030, what does that look like? And the impact is staggering. We need virtually no new investment in capacity by 2030, compared with 8 gigawatts of PV, significant investment in CCGT, and so on. So, and the cost differential between the total portfolio cost for business as usual at about $70 billion, it reduces that to about $64 billion. So it's over, roughly speaking, just under 10% reduction.
Okay, thank you. I'd like to take us a little bit somewhere else now, so that we don't get too much bogged down on gas and renewables, because we did have quite a large set of questions that we'd like to explore. I think there's quite a lot there to reflect on. What I'd like to take us next is now purely into renewables, purely into solar. I'd like to explore a little bit the difference between sort of large scale and maybe decentralized rooftop systems and all of that. But let's stick with the large scale for a second, perhaps Raed and Yara. Could I hear from you what you think determines success in the large scale utility market in this year, in the next 3 years, in terms of those projects that we see coming online that we saw earlier?
I would say ultimately the end state and what success would look like is definitely very competitive, low, sustainable tariffs. That is what success is. However, this comes in stages. And there are different stages of success. For instance, the subsidy reform, creating a competitive market, creating a clear procurement process. All of these are mini successes that are enablers towards this end state of getting to a point where you know that you're going to have a low tariff that is sustainable for both power and water being very interconnected.
Okay, subsidies, policy, tariffs. Rabia, would you like to pick up on that briefly? Are we seeing enough of that policy change happening in the pace at which we might need it?
I think I think Paolo's point in his presentation, yes, targets, and we've said that repeatedly, targets, plans that are announced, etc., in the region are very at the seed of enthusiasm, but we are starting to see recently, through Dubai particularly, some translation of those targets into concrete policies that will move deployment, that will really make a difference. And I think this is why we are seeing some very nice examples through Dubai. But I think there's a long way to go in terms of introducing the appropriate policies, having the level playing field. There are some signs of progress through some of the removal of the subsidies that we've seen over the past couple of years. As was just mentioned by Yara, what is happening even in terms of a better or clearer procurement process, etc. There are certain things, but there's some ways to go, like in many countries, into translating targets and plans into more concrete policy or regulatory measures.
Raed, your perspective on this, please. What determines success?
Sure. I mean, first of all, I think it's important to emphasize there are no subsidies for utility-scale solar in the Middle East. I don't think there is no plan for any subsidies, be it decentralized or centralized, other than the limited feed-in tariff in Egypt, which was, installed for a certain reason at the time. It's not going to be any subsidies. And I think it's important to emphasize that solar has been asked to compete with subsidized oil and gas power generation in the GCC, and solar is doing it, which I think is amazing. If you talk to investors and say, do you want to invest in oil and gas in this time and day and downstream or upstream as opposed to investing in solar, I think solar is very much predictable, stable, and secure, be it ADWEC 350 or DEWA. There is value for, obviously, utility-scale solar power plants. Need for the region is to, reduce the burning rate, be it in exporting what is perceived to be cheap oil or trying to reduce the burden on fiscal planning for countries like Jordan. It's going to be driven primarily by utility-scale solar power plants, I think, for a few years to come. But we're seeing the beginnings of decentralized, commercial industrial rooftop programs like Shams Dubai, which I think they're still early stage. They're based on net metering, which is the right way to go without any artificial, manipulation. But I think more and more, it will take a little bit longer for that to ramp up, and we'll continue to see large-scale, utility-scale power plants happening, especially as utilities now realize it doesn't make sense to do 20, 10, 30 megawatts. You got to go to 250, 300, capture the economies of scale, make the ticket price, appealing to investors, and this is where you come to the, below. If you bid 7.5 cents in the GCC for the solar power plants, it's a no bid. It's really just forget it, drop it. I mean, Jordan is looking at, pretty much everybody has signed between 6.1 to 7.2 cents LCV in Jordan. So think about what's happening in the GCC.
Great, thank you very much. I'll actually skip my decentralized power question for now, because I do want to give time for just a few questions from the audience. If I could have you raise your hand if you'd like to ask a question. If we have another microphone that could be brought to you, we should have time for 2 questions before we wrap up to our panelists. And then I will hand over to Roberto, who will provide us with a summary of both sessions. Okay. I think people might be more active on the iPad than. Oh, there is a question, please, Madame.
Thank you. My name is Deepthi. I work with the Emirates Wildlife Society, WWF, here in the UAE. And my question is directed to anyone in the panel who wants to take it. But it's more around how we're, with this focus on gas that we are continuing to see, and for many years now, we've been talking about gas as a bridge fuel towards renewables. And now we are talking of this marriage between gas and renewables. So I was just trying to understand as to, doesn't the panel think that we're kind of locking populations in natural gas, and that will actually slow the transition to renewables, rather than sort of move us towards renewables quickly?
Renewables, are we doing the right thing in the decarbonization terms? Are we locking ourselves into natural gas as a fossil fuels and therefore not being able to go to renewables fast enough from a climate perspective?
Well, I can speak from the U.S. perspective. On the U.S. perspective, what's happened over the last 15 years is that, well, really over the last 5 in particular, that natural gas has displaced coal. And so much of the greenhouse gas reductions in the U.S. have been because we've displaced coal with natural gas, if natural gas is done right, meaning that if we minimize the leaks of natural gas to a minimum, then our greenhouse gas emissions actually drop as we displace coal and move to natural gas. And what we like to say at the lab is that natural gas should be a bridge fuel to the future where we have zero carbon emissions.
Thank you. We would have time for one more question if there are any very keen volunteers. All right, then I'll hand over now to Roberto, please, if you could just join us on the podium to do a summary of takeaways. Roberto Vigotti is the coordinator of the Renewable Industry Advisory Board to the International Energy Agency. So he's also behind this event and has been for the last 3 years. He and the team here have prepared that. Roberto, please, if I could hand over.
Thank you so much. Thank you very much for the introduction. Yes, this is the 3rd year we try to put together a dialogue between IEA and IRENA, and this time we decided to be open door to everybody. I think the debate was very dense. You notice we had no coffee break, which is unusual for an Italian at least. But, and I took a lot of notes, which we will prepare together with Hannes, Rabia, and Paolo, a 3-4 pages summary, which will be put on our website, at least for the IEA and IRENA and MOFA. Let me say just a thing. I appreciate very much also the pre-reading. I recommend to all of you the pre-reading of the Oxford group on Institute of Energy Studies and the forum, which is available to be downloaded. And a lot of things are in here, which was said. By the way, a lot of authors are on the podium. I think this document, which is recommended as a pre-reading, I think is really a very well done and very effective. I took 5 hours from Roma. I read all of them, and I think going back, I will write my minutes. So please, Hannes, you should provide this one available for everybody. Now, how to conclude this one is difficult. Just to say, we have a better consensus than a few years ago. We know that price competition, long-term contract, financial de-risking measure are the positive aspect, and we know that some other to-do are. It was mentioned, in fact, we have the foundation of the house, we have innovation, new markets, and I like very much what Paolo said. We have to have a system approach. We have to include also demand side, the demand of the people, and also, as we said the last time, Paolo, also beyond electricity. We have a huge amount of end user heat and transport, which will also affect. In the last meeting, we had the competition on the marriage. I don't think it's a marriage long-standing. I don't think renewable and gas will do golden ring. They will do silver ring, 25 years maybe. In the future, probably we are looking for 100% renewable with storage. But that's to be never said today. But this is the idea. Silver marriage, 25 years. Then, of course, you will see. But, of course, innovation will be driving that. We also heard about the policy still to be done. We also heard about the shift to the Paul Nielsen did. Again, I recommend the Paul Nielsen PwC paper on a transition to a new energy reform. Again, is available to be downloaded. It's excellent, and I think it deserves more attention. Of course, we also have a declaration by Enel Green Power that they expect, again, record price in 2016. I know that they are the finalists also on the Morocco bid. In any case, the Morocco bid, the Minister Amara said, is the lowest bid on any energy included, by far. And he said in Rabat last month, the wind bid in Morocco resulted in a price which is lower than the pure cost of a capital of coal. So if coal in Morocco will be free, still the wind bid will be cheaper. So this is a big news for especially the importing country. And of course, other things will have to happen. We heard also about the two financial people claiming that still the foundation for attracting capital there is still to be done. There are new instruments, green bonds. We also appreciate that they both said that efficiency is still lacking of interest in the capital market because of the fragmentation of their proposal. And that's also important. They also, I appreciate what Mike said on the Declaration of Interdependence. At least I agree with you, Mike. After Paris, the silence, the people don't try to challenge us anymore. And for me, listening to the Vice President of Eni, I remember, not here, the other one in Roma, I said, Mr. Vigoi, don't forget renewable. If we're gas, we are complementary to you. I said, I can die now, because for years I've been fighting with the petrol and fossil fuel, and now they say, we are your friends. So we'll do together some years together. It's off record. I'm a retired person, so I can do whatever I say. And finally, I agree with the fact that Paolo has been saying this forever, that ultimate instrument is a carbon price, because this is, when you put carbon price, it was shown today, will leverage the idea that coal now is cheaper than gas. We really have to acknowledge that the externalities brought by the carbon will make the difference. Therefore, indeed, renewable and gas will play together. And the foreign mechanism, I recommended the work done by the IEA and IRENA, of course, on the fact that the transformation of the system will include a lot of aspects, interconnection, demand-side management, storage, and of course, the flexibility. I like very much also the idea that the customers more and more will be engaged in managing their own supply. And in fact, the final thing that we saw similar things in the second session. I took a few notes, but Rabia, thank you very much for giving us a very true perspective. We're looking forward tomorrow to download your presentation, which, by the way, is always so interesting because it gives you facts, and I think we can use your presentation as also in our proceedings, and particularly the benefits that renewable can brought. You are an expert also in the job creation, and expert not only in water, but also in the, I think, job creation and industrialization. I remember 2-3 years ago we discussed how much local content we need from the country. Now it's not only a must, it's an opportunity. I remember 2 years ago people say, oh, local content means we don't guarantee the quality, or local content means that we cannot afford. Now is an opportunity, it's not anymore a tax. So local content means that all the countries in the MENA want to build, industrialize their society. And that's also a joint venture between us, of the OECD country, and your country. I think now it's clear that jointly working together, we can make profit over your young and knowledgeable generation. And finally, I think that again, thank you very much for that. Sorry for being so dense. We usually have this meeting, Arabia, in an hour more. This was much, and thank you for organizing this in such a way. But please look at us in the next 2-3 weeks, Hannes, for the results. And maybe next year we make another event for the 4th time, and with your support. Hannes, I cannot thank you and your colleague because you have done a tremendous job. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much, everybody. Thank you to all panelists.